Hey, welcome. We are here. This is happening. Yes. Okay. Welcome to How to Engage Another Person's Story Conference. Cathy and I have been eagerly anticipating teaching this material to you for some time now. I want to do some opening remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to Cathy. She's going to lead us off. First things, you should have received an email that provided links to a Hansel and Gretel story, the outline for note taking. If you want to take notes, we've got a kind of a detailed outline. You can type into it or you can print it out and write on it, and a link to a video clip that we will be discussing later in the day. If you didn't receive that email, you can simply go to the website that is pasted into the chat and find everything there, all the downloads, all the links. All right, let me briefly outline our day together. Cathy's going to start us off by teaching on Story Theory 101, and this will help you think through how to understand trauma narratives. And then I will take over and teach through what I call the 7 principles of story engagement. These principles are designed to help kind of orient you as you are talking with someone else about their story. Then we'll take a 15-minute break. When we return, Cathy and I will co-teach the first 6 tactics of engaging another person's story. The tactics get down into the details, the nitty-gritty of how to bring your presence to engage with another person, particularly in the context of their family of origin story. After that, Cathy is going to demonstrate how what we've been teaching today applies to an actual story, namely the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel. Then we're going to look at a film clip. We'll go from old fairy tale Hansel and Gretel to very modern television program on Apple TV called The Morning Show. It's just a short 3-minute clip, but boy, oh boy, does it shine a bright light on how to understand story. Then you'll get a much deserved lunch break. When we return from lunch, Cathy and I will go through the last 6 tactics of story engagement. And then, then really special. Our friend Bethany will be joining us from Malawi, yes, Malawi, to read one of her stories of harm from her growing up years. So a super sacred privilege of Cathy and I engaging Bethany's story live. And we will pause it from time to time and kind of explain what we're doing. But that's going to be a real sacred honor. Then we'll have a 15-minute break, and then it's Q&A time. For the last 45 minutes, Cathy and I will be answering any questions, and you can send your questions as they come up to Elise. The email address is in the chat, and we will look at them over lunch, and we will address them at the end of the conference. Before Cathy begins teaching about story theory, I want to say just a few kind of pastoral words, right, about caring for yourself today. Look, even though the focus of this conference is how to engage another person's story, we are going to be talking about trauma. We are going to be talking about family of origin stuff. And when we do, it stirs things up in our hearts. So it is likely that there will be times today that even though the focus is on engaging someone else, you're going to be brought into your own story, your own body, your own heart, your own trauma. In other words, you're going to feel some big feelings. It's probably inevitable at some point today about your own story and about your own life. And an important question that I just want you to ponder at the beginning is, what are you going to do if you get a little disrupted or overwhelmed or start to feel big feelings today? How are you going to respond, for example, if fragments of memory of your own story are stirred up by something Cathy or I say. And what we want to invite you to do, if that happens, is take a break. Take a break when you start to feel big feelings. There is a video recording of this, all right? You do not have to absorb all of this material today. You can go back and watch the video. It will be available for 3 months. So look, if you start to feel some big feelings, because something I say or something Cathy says kind of throws you back to an earlier part of your own story, why not tend to your body in that moment? How do you do that? Well, to begin with, mute me or mute Cathy. Just take a break from it. Maybe go for a short walk. Maybe just focus on your breath just for 2 minutes. These kinds of kindnesses to disrupted bodies are significantly helpful when it comes to healing from trauma. So with that as introduction to the day, Cathy.
All right. Oh, I already feel, so notice your bodies. How are you feeling already stepping into this, right? I'm in a different position than you are, but I can already feel my cortisol kind of starting to surge a little bit. Even the idea of teaching this, right, asks me to engage my own body. It asks me to engage my own story, my own thinking about my story, and it's a big deal and it's incredibly sacred. And so as we step into this, not only be aware of your own body, but also knowing that as we engage this other people's stories, to understand that this is an incredibly sacred space that none of us go into lightly. And so we're going to move through today through theory, through talking about how to engage, to give you tactics and ideas, but we're talking about real people and real stories, engaging you that has a real story and a real body, right? And so this is a big deal. It's often we underestimate what a big deal it is to connect to one another. And in this work, more than anything, we don't want you to be scared of engaging each other. It's why we're doing a conference like this. But we also want you to understand that when you step into intentionally engaging another person's story, to step in with honor, reverence, respect. And today, as we lean into some of this stuff, it can get exciting and you'll hear me like, I get psyched about the theory behind it, right? And so it'll be like, no, it's triangulation, right? You know, like as it's like, as if you're watching Jeopardy and like getting the right answer, right? You know, which is fine. That's how we learn. We get excited about being able to put pieces together. But we're talking about real trauma, real harm, right? Not just the answer to some of these questions. And so just to be aware of that as well as we step in. And so, you know, we're going to be talking about our experiences doing story work. We'll talk about people we've worked with, which is everyone and no one. So, you know, if you are like, oh, they're talking about my story, that's true. And also 50 other people on the screen, right? Because the good news and the bad news about this is that there's nothing new under the sun. And the reason why I love even using fairy tales to talk about story is that we've understood these concepts from the beginning of time, right? You can go to Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, like when you start talking about what happens between people, we've known of these things for a long time. The beautiful thing about the part of the world or history that we're living in is that we also now have neuroscience and different aspects of that show us what we've known, what we felt to be true. Now we actually know are true. Right. And so it's a lovely time to be in this work, but there is nothing new under the sun. And all of us stand on the shoulders of other people. And so, so much of the work that I've done over the years is based on Dan Allender's work, and all of the people that have gone before him. And we'll talk about all of that, but we're standing on a lot of shoulders, a lot of legacy as we lean into this. And so I also want to honor that going in. So be aware, as Adam said, of your bodies, of where you're triggered, but also that is going to be a huge piece of how you lean into other people's stories, is understanding how your body reacts. And we'll talk about more of that later, but your body is your tool. It's the thing that knows all the things that we don't want to know, which we'll also get into in a second. So we're going to do a bit of story work 101 right now, just to have a sense of what happens to the human body, the human heart, when we start to encounter the world, right? And so what happens to us when we're young deeply matters to who we become as adults. We know this. So I talk about it in this way, where when you're little, you have experiences, and according to whatever experience you have, we adapt. Everyone adapts to whatever is available to us. We adapt to our actual environment. I don't know if any of you are from the South. I am not from the South. I've been in the Pacific Northwest for 18 years. If you put me in humidity, I want to crawl under a bush and die. Like, I cannot. It is too hot for me. And if you ask me to like walk or hike, I will be like, no, thank you. Right? My body has adapted to being in the Pacific Northwest, which is like between 40 degrees and like 75. That is the range of the weather in the Pacific Northwest. It is not humid. This is where we live. I am always like 2 layers away from winter or summer. This is the body that I live in now, right? We adapt to, and I have kids. I have 2 kids who live here and have been born here. They go to the South. My husband's from Alabama. We visit the family and they're like this: Mom, it is too hot. And then they go in the air conditioning and they're like, it's too cold. I'm like, oh, I have Pacific Northwest babies who don't understand any of this, right? So my point in that is that we are created to adapt. And we will adapt to whatever story is handed to us. It's the way we survive. It is a gift. And as we grow and become adults, how we've adapted becomes maladaptive later. Because whatever you've adapted to when you were young is now behavior that actually keeps you bound to stories of harm. So that's really what we're talking about today. Do we understand our maladaptive behavior, right? And we're talking about ourselves and others. Like, this is the theory that we're looking at. Do we understand our maladaptive behavior? What's actually keeping us from joy, from delight? What keeps us in anxiety? What keeps us bound to depression, shame, fear, right? Disordered ways of living, isolation. There are all these things that are happening up here that are difficult to understand and do anything about unless you understand the why. And many of us and many of the people that you'll be engaging with, whether that's you're a pastor, whether you're a therapist or a teacher, whether you're in ministry, whether you're in nonprofit work or business, it doesn't matter what your job is. What we're talking about is how to actually relate to people in a way that helps them move towards healing. And so people will often come to us, to you, and say, gosh, I'm really struggling with X. On so many of us, and it's not bad, but we'll be like, oh, have you tried, do you remember? I'm from the 90s, so it was like, keep every thought captive, where literally the youth group people would tell us to put rubber bands on our wrists And every time we had a thought we didn't want to have, we would hold it captive for Jesus, and we would snap our our rubber bands. Am I alone in this? This is terrible. Now that I'm talking about it, I'm like, it's really abusive. But this is what we did. So it was like, like, think better. Don't do that. Change your behavior. Like, how many of you have been trying to, like, I've been trying to work out for years. Well, it's not about like my desire to go to the gym, which also gyms are awful. Like, can we just say, I mean, I know some of you love them, but I go in and I'm like, this is where we all go to die. This is what's happened now that we're not actually living on the earth. We've manufactured ways to, anyways, this is just a soapbox that you can nail me on later. But, and I am a member of a gym, so that's fine. But this is, we get so disconnected, right, from how we were meant to be. And then we think, oh, we can just fix it here in the present. Well, that doesn't work. It may work for a little bit. It may work for, like 6 weeks but the stats around New Year's, all the New Year's resolutions that happen, they are done by like January 21st. Right? Like, we don't have a lot of staying power. And the reason for that isn't because we're not disciplined or we're not capable. It's because we have to actually look and understand our adaptive behavior. What happened? How did we have to adjust in order to live in the world that we were living in? And without understanding the why, we're not actually going to be able to heal and let the trauma and the harm of our past move through us. So the premise we're starting with is this: we were created and designed for Eden. We were created and designed for perfect love from God, perfect connection from God, perfect connection with ourselves, like the way we understand ourselves and our interconnectedness, perfect connection with the earth, right? And that's something we don't often talk about either. We're meant to be in communion with the earth. We were created to have dominion and dominion isn't a word that's just like, like we're conquering the earth. It's like the way that you plant a garden. We're meant to cultivate and care and tend, right? That matters to who we are as human beings. And we're also meant to have perfect connection with each other. That's what we're designed for. And we have a memory of that in our bodies, and each person you work with has a memory of that in their bodies. But we are born into a fallen world where very quickly we realize that's not what we're living in. So something of what we're created for, we're meant for, is shattered. I have 2 kiddos. When my babies were born, they did what most babies do, and they cried. Their assumption when they came out of my body is that I can scream, I can cry, and someone will soothe me. There will be someone here waiting for me to tend to my body, to help me calm down, to soothe, to wrap me up and get me warm again, to feed me. Our assumption coming into the world is that, and Kurt Thompson says this really well, we're looking for someone who's looking for us. And our automatic assumption is that there is someone there who will find us. It's built into our DNA. Now, a lot of us were born into families that did an okay job holding on to that. Like when my first son was born, I had a very, very difficult pregnancy, and they called it the Bermuda Triangle of pregnancies. So they had to take him 3 weeks early, not an emergency C-section, but it was like, we're going to let him bake for as long as we can. And then as soon as he's viable, we're going to take him out because it's just super dangerous in there. So I was like, fine. But also, just for any of you who work with women who are pregnant, to call it the Bermuda Triangle of pregnancy, like, that's just not something to say to a pregnant woman. Like, it's just, so So that was me. So when Liam was born, I was already in a rough state. My cortisol was already high. The operation to get him out of me was very complicated. They have like 10 people in the room. They had to hold off because they needed to make sure they had enough blood of my type on site in the operating room to make sure that when I started to bleed out, they would be able to save me. They knew what was coming, right? So I'm like afraid. I'm not doing well. I've spent 9 months, already being, anyways, it was a mess. I was a mess. So when and then when Liam came out, he was having trouble breathing. They let me see him and then they took him away and then they tried to save me on the table as I was bleeding out. They saved me, put me into a separate room to observe me, to make sure that I was okay. I'm separated from my baby. And in that moment, if you had told me I hadn't actually been pregnant, I was just like, that was a dream, and I would have believed you. I'd have been like, okay, right. I just had a surgery and now I'm recovering. Like I had zero connection to the fact that I just had this baby. Right. And so when they handed Liam to me, I was already dysregulated. I was already afraid, and I'm like feeling like, wait, who is this child? Like, what am I supposed to do? I had the sense that my mom gene would just turn on. It didn't. I was plunged into postpartum depression. My milk supply was off. Like it was a nightmare. Right. And so my point in saying that is that our origins matter. So even in that moment, I'm a decent human being. I'm at that point, I was the head of the Allender Center. Like, it's like I know how to like attune to my baby. I teach this stuff from the front. Well, in that moment, the first time that Liam engages with me, he is looking for my face, and my face is panicked, and I don't know what to do. So even in the best case scenario, right, there is shattering and disruption as soon as we come onto this earth. And that's not everyone's story. Some moms, are great and good. And for some of you, this is really hitting home because hardly anyone talks about postpartum depression and anxiety and the realities of what that looks like. My point in it is that every baby has a story, even if the parents are decent and kind and trying to connect, right? Liam and I bonded, we did fine. I got help. We worked through it, right? Kids are incredibly resilient, which we'll get to in a second. But our origin stories matter. And right away, when we start to look around, our assumption is that there is someone here and we're not born into Eden. We're born onto the earth. So that matters. And that shifts something that happens to us. And so our experiences tell us that the world is not safe and that we need to adjust our way of relating in order to match what's available to us. And let me say that again. A child will shift their style of relating, the way they're relating, their expectations of care to match what's available to them. It's such a simple concept, and yet it is very meaningful to then understanding what's happening for us up here. Right. So as a child, if you realize, okay, yes, I have a mom and a dad, and they're here, they're caring for my physical needs, but emotionally they're not available. If you start to pick up on that as a child, you shift your style of relating. And then you adapt your expectation of care. So then as an adult, you're wondering, why is it so hard for me to be comfortable with intimacy? Why is it so hard for me to need, I don't know if you're one of those people. I am. When someone's like, how are you? I'm like, fine. I'm fine. Like, no, how are you really? Oh, no, really, I'm fine. Okay, but your face like looks really sad. Oh. Right. Yeah, I think I'm actually feeling really anxious, right? It takes me a second because my automatic impulse is to be fine. Now that's like, again, a small thing, but when you look at where that comes from, something taught me early on that it's better to be fine, because if you're not, there's not someone there to tend to your complex emotional needs. Right? So whatever your story is, you have learned how to adjust your style of relating. And I'm talking about your stories because the way you start to engage someone else's story is if you also understand the reality of how you have come to be as well. They're so connected. So as you're working with someone, you're always looking at the basic premise that their maladaptive behavior up here is connected to their adaptive behavior back here. Here's the good news. I know, everyone's like, thank you for the good news, because this is very bad. No, there's good news. The good news is that we're incredibly adaptive. And our bodies and brains actually really want to heal, even though it's very difficult. And so there are two concepts I want to look at. There is there is embedded trauma, and then there are things called traumatic events. So in a family that is actually able to handle hard things, a child can handle and move through very difficult circumstances. So just because something really hard has happened to a child doesn't mean that that trauma is now lodged. And when we're talking about story work, right, we're talking about that there are stories in our past, and we're assuming that there are stories that have embedded trauma lodged in them. So let's talk about how that embedded trauma occurs, right? You know, because there are lots of things that happen where, and you can even think of this in your own childhood. You know, if there was a car accident, if there was a death of a loved one, if there was a divorce, if you actually suffered abuse, but you had a family system that was able to care for you, get you the help that you needed, it's a difficult thing that you went through. But that becomes a traumatic event, not an embedded trauma. So we need a certain amount of things for a traumatic event to stay a traumatic event versus turn into an embedded trauma. We need attunement. So there's a great book by Dan Siegel called The Whole Brain Child. And it's a book about raising kids. I use it to raise myself. You're welcome to use it for whatever you need. It's a small little book, but it's super helpful. And basically what he talks through this example of a kid who gets into a car accident as a little kid, like a 5-year-old boy. And so there are basically like these moments in our lives where there can be two paths: the path toward embedded trauma, the path towards a traumatic event. And the difference is not the event itself. The difference is how your family responds. So in one case, let's say this kid got into a car accident, the nanny was driving, the babysitter, whatever, and the mom finds out, the parents find out that this child has been in a car accident. They meet the ambulance. They're with the child at the hospital, and the mom and the dad come in, and they're like, oh my gosh, buddy, you know, like, we're here, you're okay, you're safe, right? They're connected, they're attuning, and they're helping the child start to process what happened, right? Because they know that this child, if they've gone through trauma, they're experiencing three things: fragmentation, dissociation, and isolation. So these are the three impacts of trauma. At any stage when we experience trauma, those are the three things that our body naturally does. Dissociation, which is basically just like, I don't want to see what's happening, so I'm going to let my brain go to other things in order to distract and numb from what just happened, right? That's a pretty normal one. We get that. Isolating, it's like it's easier to be alone and deal with myself or care for myself than it is to be in connection with other people and bear the weight of their bad care potentially. The one that I want to focus on is fragmentation. Fragmentation is when the brain experiences something that overwhelms all the systems. And it's basically like the puzzle, all of the pieces that are available to someone in a moment of trauma. The brain realizes this is too much and it throws the puzzle into the air and then separates the pieces throughout the brain, throughout the body. That's what we do. And then, so when you look at a traumatic memory, when you're looking at a traumatic memory of someone else, you'll assume that you're getting bits and pieces of the memory. So the parents going into this child's hospital room they're understanding that this child just had an experience that they, one, don't fully understand because they're so little, and two, they are going to need help putting the pieces back together. So what we know about healing, and this is the premise of story work, is that the way we heal is crafting a more accurate biographical narrative of our childhood traumas and story. Let me say that again. Crafting a more accurate biographical narrative of our childhood stories and trauma. Because what happens when we fragment is that the whole story is still in our bodies, but it's separated. And so we feel it all, but until it's defragmented, until it's put back together, it's almost like trauma shrapnel that's lodged in the body. So our role is to grab the shrapnel and start to piece it together so that we can have an understanding of what really happened. Because when we have an understanding, our bodies, our minds, our souls are able to integrate, and we can move the trauma through our system. So, guys, I see your raised hands, and I am sorry that we can't stop to answer questions. But if you guys have questions, please make sure that you get those questions to the email that Elise has in the chat, and then we will look at those questions and we'll answer them at the end of the day. So I'm deeply sorry. I know that this is confusing. And also just to pause, this is high level work. I know this is supposed to be Story Work 101, but this is the heavy lifting right now, okay? This is to create a baseline. And so for some of you who are more lay leaders, and this is the first time even looking at this language, a lot of the clients I work with are like, please say that in a way that I can understand. Like, I'm sorry. At least I'm not Dan Allender, who uses even worse. Like, I listen to Dan and I'm like, I don't understand half of the words that he's using. I have to Google them. But the point in all of this is that as we defragment, our bodies can actually settle and we can move through them. So Dan Siegel's point in this book is that when you have a child who's gone through a trauma, if we can slow it down for them, if we can start to piece together all of the things that happened, even to the degree of saying, hey, buddy, I know you probably saw some really scary things. Did you see Sally, the nanny, like she had blood on her head because she hit the steering wheel? That would have been really scary to see that. I just want you to know that she's safe and that we're safe and it's okay, right? And then there would have been an ambulance coming. Those were pretty loud sirens. That's what you were hearing. And then you would have had strangers come and unstrap you out of the car and mama wasn't there. And that is so scary. It's okay, right? So what they're doing is helping that child. You're making some assumptions around what the child would have experienced, and you're helping them put it back together so that they don't have these different pieces. And you do that slowly, you do that over time, you do that with a lot of care and intentionality. It is hard and painstaking to move a child through a traumatic event, but it's possible, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, right? But you can move a child through that, and then you'll notice that the child will bring it back again and be like, I'm thinking about this thing, or they'll start to have nightmares, or they'll start to be scared of going into the car. Like, you're going to see residual effects of all of this. And parents who are attuned to a child will be able to move through that and help the child deal and allow that trauma to settle and to move through their bodies. We are able to do that, right? So that's what could happen. Most of the stories that we're talking about when we talk about engaging someone else's stories are the times where that didn't happen. So let's look at the other scenario where the mom is, she works a lot. Maybe she's a CEO of a company, really big, important job. She hates the fact that she's working, but she also loves her work. And so she feels very ambivalent about the fact that she's had to kind of give her son over to this nanny. And now the nanny and the son are more connected than she and the son are. And so she's also a little bit envious of the nanny, but but is really connected to her work. So she's already in this war. So now the nanny that she's set up to be with her and her son now gets into an accident, right? And so this mom arrives on the scene, and what is she feeling? She's feeling guilt. She's feeling tension in her own body. She also knows that she doesn't have the same connection to her son that the nanny does, right? So already she's coming into the room in a difficult emotional position to be able to attune to her son. So she steps into the room, and immediately she's like talking to the doctors really aggressively, like, well, what happened? Did you do a CT scan? What's going on? And she's like, Johnny, I'm so sorry that this happened to you. I should have never let you drive with that woman, right? She turns on the nanny, right? So you can see how immediately her position as she walks in is one of, she's adversarial, she's not grounded, she's unsettled, right? And she needs to blame the nanny and then be angry with the staff in order to assuage her own guilt and shame. Well, where does that leave the little boy? Right? So now this little boy is left with his own trauma, and also now he's in the position of trying or needing to tend to his own mother instead of her tending to him. Right? Those are kind of extreme versions, but you can understand how one version would become a traumatic event that the child can move through, still difficult, but possible. The other one, this child is having to now shut down all of his experience because he's watching all of this complexity happen around him. And what we know from neuroscience is that by the age of 5, a child can accurately read the intention and emotional complexity of a room. They don't always know what it means, but they can read it. So this child intuitively understands, even if the child doesn't have language for it, mom and nanny are at odds. I have to pick. Do I pick to side with mom? Do I pick to, and knowing that there's existential death with mom if he picks nanny. So really he doesn't have much of a choice. He knows he has to now side and align with mom. But what's not happening in any of that is anyone siding and aligning with him. He's now left alone to deal with this trauma. All right, and so I won't necessarily belabor the story, but it's you can start to extrapolate and understand what this would mean in terms of the difference between a traumatic event and an embedded trauma. Same moment, same thing that happened to this boy in both stories, different ways that the family handled it, right? And so that's what we're always, when we talk about abuse, and we'll talk about this later in the afternoon, but abuse never happens in a vacuum. We're always assuming that a story is not necessarily always about the moment or the thing that happened. It's about the culture and the system that that thing was embedded in the middle of. And so as you're looking at stories, you're always wanting to understand what's the system and the culture, because that's what they had to adapt to. So in some ways, you're becoming detectives. You're understanding like this is something. So if someone comes to you and says, I'm having a really hard time with my spouse, we're having a lot of we're fighting all the time, and we're just at odds, and this is what's going on. You can assume that there's something in their family of origin that has kept them from being attuned to learning about containment, like how do you actually stay safe in your environment? How do you do rupture and repair, right? So, and again, I'm throwing a lot of terminology out there, and some of you know all this because you've been in this world for a little bit, and some of you, this is new, but we'll get into some of it this afternoon. The point is that we can move through trauma, but part of this work is understanding where there's been embedded trauma. And then as you're engaging someone's story, you're trying to go back to these stories that never received the care that they needed in the first place. That's all we're doing. Because you can still heal from that embedded trauma in the present if you go back, if you receive good care around it. That is the beautiful thing about how God created us. Yes, we live in a fallen world, and I believe God created ways in which we could handle it and move through it in a way that can create healing. So it's not too late if you had really difficult childhood. We can go back and reparent, recare for those parts and allow us to move through that. So I like to think about it this way. A lot of people who come, to your office, to my office, to as a pastor, whatever you do, they come when they're kind of in crisis, or there's a moment where they're like, however they have been adapting and dealing with the world isn't working anymore. So the way I like to look at that is that we have like a stream, a river, that's our life. And in the stream and the river, if we have childhood trauma that has become embedded, I like to think of them as big logs that get wedged. And you can handle even a few logs, right? And the water can still move through. And so if the water is like the day-to-day stuff that's happening in your life, right? The things that happen, again, if you have kids or families, like, you're always, every time I go to pick up my kid from school, I'm like, how was he today? Right? It's like an active trauma that I'm like scared because I hate the fact that he's struggling, right? So I'm like preparing myself to pick up my kid from school. Now, my capacity to deal with that moment is directly related to how many logs I have in my log jam, right? Because if you have this river that needs to be able to flow the trauma through it in order for you to stay healthy, for you to stay regulated, for you to still be able to deal with joy and sadness and all the things, right? You have a healthy ecosystem moving through you. If you start to have logs that are there from, let's say your first one happened at 3, 5, 7, 9, well, those logs start to add up. So then by the time you're 16, 18, 20, 22, right? Then you have like maybe smaller logs, but when those smaller logs hit the bigger logs, well, now you start to have a problem. Because now, it starts to build up, and eventually whatever riverbed you have gets overflowed because the trauma becomes bigger than the bed. So you start to flood. So people will come in feeling flooded and not understanding why, like, that little fight that I had with my colleague is now like putting me over the edge, right? All of a sudden they'll feel flooded, they won't understand, and they'll look at that fight and go, this doesn't seem proportional to what actually just happened, right? Well, when your system is flooded, when you have the logs in place, it doesn't take much for then all of a sudden the whole thing to flood. And you can't just deal with the branch or the little log or the little, thing that created the moment in the present. In order to actually move your body through trauma, you have to start to take out some of those bigger logs. And so that's, and look, it is, when someone wants to just deal with the present because they don't want to go to the past, this is a very uncomfortable moment when you're working with anyone. To tell them, like, I'm really sorry, yes, you're in crisis up here, but it's, this isn't going to be helpful for us to do a ton of work here, because we need to release some of the water and some of the log jam in order to allow us to have some room to move some of the trauma through you. So you have to go back to some of these core moments in their history, in their childhood, and start to help them move the logs out of the way in order for their ecosystem to then be able to handle their current trauma, handle the, stay regulated in the midst of conflict with colleagues, with spouses, with kids. But you can't do that if your system is flooded, if it's not working. And so that's why our theory is that you have to go back. You have to go back and start to say, okay, what actually got lodged first? What got embedded first? And can we start to dislodge some of that to start to create a more accurate biographical narrative? And what we understand from childhood is that we see intuitively a lot. But to see it is too difficult, too complex. It would mean having to deal with difficult aspects of our parents that we're not ready to do at the age of 5. So let me tell you a story. I've, again, 2 kids. They're boys. They love Legos. Some of you who have heard me speak, you've heard me tell this story. It's really my favorite. So they, I don't know how many of you have kids. Legos have changed since the 80s. And, when I was a kid, you had like a box of Legos and you played with Legos. Like, that's what you did. You put them together, you made houses, you did stuff. Now the Legos, it's like engineering. Like, you have to follow the design and the directions. And like, I am telling you that these little pieces that they have in these Lego sets are insane. Like, I'm not good at things like this. I don't like following directions. It's just real, like, to concentrate. And even now that I'm in my 40s, like, I can't even see the directions because I need glasses. So, it's just a thing. And frankly, I just don't want to. I don't want to do it. And so inevitably the kid, around birthday times or just because, we're bored and we've indulged our children, we have a new Lego set. And so my kids don't want to do the Lego sets alone. So my son, Aiden, he's 6, he'll come and be like, Mama, can you come and do the Legos? And so I'm looking at my little boy who is super sweet and wants to spend time with me. And I love that. And I'm like, oh, buddy, I would love nothing more than to play with you and to do the Legos. But Mama is so busy and I have all the dishes and I have to start cooking dinner, and you know what? I can't do it. But why don't you go have your brother help you? It's why we had 2 kids. So go play with each other, and let me go do this, right? And so my child is listening to me, and what am I doing? I'm lying. It's a white lie. It's like whatever. I'm trying to save his feelings. I'm trying to save my feelings. I'm trying to stay a good mom. I don't actually want to be the mom that doesn't want to play with the Legos. I also don't want to be honest with him, right? And so in his mind, we know he can accurately read me. He knows I don't want to play with him. But in his mind, it's better for him to align with me, to collude with me, in order for him not to have to deal with the devastation of knowing that he has a mom in this moment that doesn't want to play with him. So he says, okay, he believes me. So what are we doing? What am I doing in that moment? I'm creating a war within his body because now he has two narratives. He has my narrative that I really want him to believe, which is a lie, that I really want to play with him. I just have too much to do. He also has the narrative that's in his body that's telling him, Mom doesn't want to play with me. Well, which one is he going to believe? He's going to align with me because he doesn't want to believe that his mom doesn't want to play. Neither of us want to believe that I'm a mom who doesn't want to play Legos with him. But now he's in a story war in his body because in his body, he knows the truth. So a child will override what they know intuitively in their bodies in order to align with what your parent or what's being offered to you. Now, that's a very benign story, right? But that happens on every scale in family systems. So what happens is that as you're working with an adult, they have two stories in their bodies. They have the story that they had to believe in order to keep their family intact. And then they have the story that they intuitively understood and knew in their body that they had to override. And so the work of story work is to help us deal with the reality that this story is like this. And so when Aiden, is older, I have two funds that we save for in our family. One is college, one is therapy. It's fine. I hope many of you are available as my children need therapy, especially having two therapist parents. Don't want to understand what that's going to mean for them, but we're saving up. And so there's something that he is going to have to start to reconcile, because when he starts to feel disconnected or angry or some of these emotions come up around his engagement with me, he's going to have to then have someone that can help tell a truer story of what happened or what happened to him and the why. So our role working with people is to help people tell a truer story of their narrative. So we're defragmenting, we're pulling the story back together, and we're also helping people become more honest about what they know that they don't want to know. So we look away from our stories all the time. It's like, we see something. So in that moment, Aiden saw me. He saw my face. He knows how to read me. And he looked away and denied his own sense of what's true in order to align with a mother that he does not want to lose relationship with. It's the most natural thing in the world that we do. And it's okay. So let's talk about it's okay and not okay. It's human, right? We all do it. And so what should I have done? Right? What's a more honest telling in that moment? How could that be like a traumatic event versus an embedded trauma? It would be me saying, oh, buddy, I know how much you love Legos. And I love that for you. I just don't really feel like playing right now. I feel kind of overwhelmed by everything else that is going on around me. And I'll tell you what, give me a half hour or an hour or whatever to deal with some of this stuff, get some of these things off my plate, and then I'll come back and I'll help you with the Legos. Is that okay? So do you see that shift? Right? And so that's just a sense of how, like, what in our current moment, how do we stay more connected to a truer story? but also it's an example of what could be, but for most of us, that's just not what happened. And most people that you're working with, they are going to have two different stories in their bodies. And so our job is to be able to connect to, like, what did you see that you turned away from? And most of that information is in your body. So you can feel, it's called your gut instinct, right? And this is, you know, for another class in their time, but one of the most brilliant things that we can learn how to do as story work people is to start to listen to our guts on behalf of other people's gut instincts. It's called limbic resonance. That's like the 401 version, but we actually have an intuitive way where our bodies connect to one another, even over a screen, where we can start to understand what the body is telling us, maybe even more than what our left brain can tell us. And basically what we're talking about is that you have a right brain and a left brain. Your right brain encodes all of your instinctual body memory. Your left brain gives meaning, language to it, and decides kind of what's true. Story work is where we bring both of them together and start to help them talk. And our belief is that as we talk, our bodies reintegrate and those log jams start to move through. So the log, like, we don't actually have to like get a crane and crank it out. What happens, I think, when you do work together and when you start to integrate, the log kind of gets more pliable, and you can kind of move it through your body. And part of how you move it through your body is grief, is through a drop into the sense of what actually happened to you, what happened to the person you're working with. And you're helping them move into a place of understanding, like, it was actually worse than you thought. But your body already knows that. That's why you're struggling with depression, with body aches, with tension, with headaches, right? Our bodies are telling us a story, and we have the capacity to integrate those things, but we have to be able to lean into some of these stories in order to do so. So I think I'm looking at my notes just to make sure I've hit everything. So the point, two things, and I'll end here. We need to understand how our stories have been encoded and fragmented, and start to defragment them, right? That's the work. We also need to start to understand that the way of our style of relating in the present is directly connected to these things that happened in our past. And we have protective measures that we've built in order to stay safe back here that are now keeping us from relationship and health up here. We have to be looking at both of those things. They're intricately connected, but we have to have an eye and a lens for both of those as we move into story work, right? So how are you protecting yourself? Because your protective mechanisms, while they've kept you safe to a degree, they're now keeping you bound to harm. So we want to look at that, and we want to understand and be able to tell a truer story of a biographical narrative by defragmenting and allowing the parts of us that know a story and the part of us that knows a story to start to talk. I can't ask you if it makes sense or not because you can't talk to me, but nod your head. Okay, great. All right, Adam.
Okay. All right. What we want to transition to now is more specifically how to engage with somebody else's story. And the first thing I want to say is that both listening to someone's story and responding well to it is part art and it's part science. In other words, there are certain principles that apply, that principles that can be taught. That's the science part. We're going to talk about that. Then there is something, I don't know how else to say it, that needs to be caught. And you catch it by watching other people who know how to do it well. And that's the art part. So the first point that I really want to make is that story engagement can be learned. Okay. It is not some mysterious ability that some people are born with and other people just aren't. The notion, that Adam is good at this, but I never could be good at this. It's a bogus notion. I was not good at story engagement when I first began this work in 2013. I had no idea where to start after I heard a story. I didn't know what to focus on. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what not to say. This is something that can be learned. Here's how Dan Allender puts it. I think this is a really helpful and provocative way of thinking about it. He says only two things are required to begin engaging someone's story. And those two things are humility and courage. And then he says skill will eventually follow. If you have humility and courage, skill will eventually follow. Now notice, humility and courage, those things cannot be taught. But if you are growing in those two attributes in your own personal life, humility and courage, the rest can be taught. And it is our deep desire to teach you some of that stuff today. So I want to take you through some of the core principles of effectively engaging someone's story. Imagine you're sitting in a room, a coffee shop, whatever, and someone has just read one of their stories to you. Coffee shop's probably not the best place to do this, but you've heard someone's story. You're sitting with them. What do you say when they're done reading or done narrating, when they're done telling you the story? Here are some principles that you can keep in mind. Number one, attunement, and I'll explain what I mean by that, is way more important than engaging their story brilliantly. All right. No matter how skillful, trained, gifted you are at engaging someone's story, the narrative, if you are not attuned to what is happening inside that person's heart and body in vivo as they are talking with you, then you are going to miss them and you're not going to be very helpful to them. It is impossible to overstate the power of attunement when it comes to engaging someone's story. Now, what is attunement? Okay. To attune to someone is to pay attention to their non-verbal communication. Facial expression, tone of voice, body language. That's what I mean by nonverbal communication. To attune to their facial expression, their tone, subtle shifts in their tone of voice, their body language, and to track their emotions and bodily sensations. Right? That's what I mean by attunement. It is very common, especially when you're first starting out in this work, as you've heard someone's story, right? You're hearing their story, and it's very common to focus all of your mental energy on the story itself and miss what is happening for the storyteller right now as they are sitting across from you. Now, look, attunement does not mean that you have to be a mind reader. All right. Those are not synonyms. You're allowed, for example, to ask questions. Questions like, what are you feeling in your body right now after having just told me that story? Questions like, how is your heart after reading that story to me? All right, those kinds of questions will allow you to attune to the storyteller. They allow you to track with the storyteller's affect. More on affect in a bit. These questions will allow you to to stay attuned, to tune in like a radio, an FM radio, to tune in to the storyteller's inner experience in their body. And what that does for them is they feel felt. That's a term coined by Dan Siegel. Cathy and I are big fans of him. I love this term, feeling felt. What does it mean? When somebody feels felt, they have the sense that you know what's going on for them internally right now. They feel joined. You feel connected. There's a joining together. It's what Cathy meant when she said limbic resonance. Your right limbic brain and their right limbic brain are simpatico. They're in sync. So when the storyteller feels like you care about how the story they've just shared is affecting them, like now in the present, rather than having a sense that they only care about engaging my story really, really well. They want to know that you care about them right now. So to say something like, I just noticed a shift in your facial expression. You don't need to know what the shift means. This is not magic. You're not clairvoyant. But to ask, what are you feeling right now? I saw a shift on your face. What's just happened for you right there? All right, these inquiries, just questions like that, use it, put it in your words, questions like that. Communicate to the storyteller that you are committed to understanding their present experience and that you want to be with them in that present experience. Here's why this is so important. You have to remember, all right, here's my contribution to Story Theory 101. You have to remember that the worst part of so many of the stories that you will hear is not the bad event itself, what Cathy was calling the traumatic event. It is the fact that the storyteller was utterly alone in the midst of the trauma, the bad event, and utterly alone in the aftermath of the really bad event. So by being with them emotionally, limbic resonance-ly, by being with them right now, you're actually giving the storyteller a taste of what it could have been like if someone was attuned to them when they were 9 years old and that really bad thing happened to them. And that, in and of itself, that attunement is very, very healing for the brain. So as you begin to dialogue with the storyteller, as you begin to say some things and ask some questions and there's a back and forth, there's give and take, you've got to be attuned to how your words and your presence, your face, your tone of voice, how it's affecting them. You got to check in with them and see like how they are experiencing you. All right. Yeah. I mean, do you feel it in your body? There's something very, very intimate about this work. And the better you are at it, the more intimate it is going to feel. You do not have to be Jesus and know what the storyteller is feeling and thinking. You can simply ask them, what are you feeling about what I just said? Or I say this, some version of this sentence a lot. I say, I just said something using some pretty strong language. How are you feeling about what I just said? Now, there are two keys to attuning to another person's inner bodily experience. And those two keys are paying attention to their body, i.e. their nonverbal communication, face, tone of voice. And the second key is paying attention to your body, right? Your body. I'm going to talk about both of these. Number one, their body. You have to watch someone's face very closely. You have to. The face never lies. They disagree whether it's 42 or 43. You have either 42 or 43 muscles in your face. All right. As a professional actress, Reese Witherspoon has the ability to make her face, those 42 or 43 muscles of her face, look surprised when she is filming a scene. That's what she's good at. She can do that. She can make her facial muscles look surprised if that's what the scene calls for. However, if Reese Witherspoon is genuinely surprised by something, she cannot make her face look bored. Why? Because the 42 muscles of your face are connected to your nervous system. Therefore, when you feel surprise, shame, sorrow, whatever, your face automatically changes into a muscular configuration that displays the emotion that you're feeling. So the storyteller is giving you gobs of information through those 42 muscles in their face. Now, look, I'm not suggesting you need to become a perfect face reader. You don't need to know the facial muscles that contract when someone is sad versus the ones that contract when they're ashamed. I don't know that stuff. You just need to notice when their facial muscles shift. You just need to notice subtle changes on their face. Anytime somebody's facial expression changes, or anytime their tone of voice shifts, what that means is that something important and meaningful is happening inside their brain and their body. You want to know what that important and meaningful shift is. So you can't attune to someone without paying attention to their face and their tone of voice. Now, second thing, second key, your body. Your body. Now, I know this sounds strange. To engage someone's story well, you need to frequently check in with like below your chin, especially to your belt buckle, like that part of you. You need to frequently check in with that portion of your body and see what you are feeling emotionally when the other person is speaking. As this, for example, as the storyteller is telling you about how she was terrorized by her older sister growing up, how her older sister would pin her down and get on top of her and pound her back when she was a 7-year-old girl. When she's telling you that, you need to feel in your body something of what the storyteller would have felt inside her 7-year-old body. And we all need to grow in this ability, which is to say, we need to develop a portion of our brain called the anterior insula. There is a part of your brain called the insula, all right? And the front portion, the anterior portion of the insula, it's the part of your brain that is activated, that comes online when you are aware of what is happening in your throat, your chest, your gut, your torso. This ability to be aware of the sensations inside your body is called interoception with an I, interoception. Interoception is very important when it comes to engaging someone else's story, and it happens in your insula. Now, here's how Dan Siegel puts it. He says, the more interoception and insula activation, the more capacity we will have for tuning into others and being empathic of their experience. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that fascinating? The more you are able to know what you're feeling in here, the more you will be able to empathize with the storyteller. So, as the storyteller narrates what happened when they were 11, notice the feelings you have inside your body. It is a gold mine of data in this work. What you're feeling in your body. Do you find yourself feeling frantic? Is it difficult to breathe? Do you feel shame? Do you feel yourself departing? Do you feel overwhelming sorrow? At what part of the story do you feel the most sense of connection to the girl in the story? All right, all of those kinds of clues will help you know something of what the storyteller is feeling inside their body. So this next sentence might sound strange, but I don't know how else to say it. Good story engagement is far more about attunement than about story engagement. Let me quote Siegel one more time. He says that we feel heard or seen by another person when we can detect that they have attuned to us, and hear this phrase, taken us inside their own mind. When we ourselves register this attunement, our own state, physiological state, can change. The observed takes in the observer, having taken her in, and the two become joined. Okay, I know that was a lot. He's trying to articulate this idea of feeling felt. This idea of feeling joined by another person. Look, you know what it's like. If you have ever felt truly seen and heard by a therapist, a friend, a pastor, a policeman, somebody who has listened to you and taken your words and your face seriously, you know what it's like. Nothing feels safer because somebody is with you in a very hard place. That makes us human beings feel very safe. And when that happens, when you are able to allow the storyteller to feel felt, that is a moment of deep connection. And you are made, by the way, you are made for that level of care and intimacy. Is this an intimate endeavor? Absolutely. And you are made for that by God, in my opinion, for that level of connection and intimacy. You're made to offer it, and in the name of Jesus, you are made to receive it. We all need this. All right, that was principle number one. Principle number two, kindness will take you further than skill. Now, please, when I say kindness, I do not mean being a nice person. I don't mean being a sweet and compassionate listening ear. Kindness is not niceness. Kindness requires humility and boldness. In other words, kindness, the way I'm using it here, the way Cathy and I are talking about it, requires moving into terrain that most people are too afraid to enter. Good story engagement, in other words, it starts in your gut. I'm pointing at my gut. You can't see it on the screen. It starts with a guttural desire that you have for the storyteller to experience freedom in places where they are bound. In other words, as you're taken inside the storyteller's world, as they share with you, you have to want things for them that they might not yet want for themselves. That's what kindness is about. It's about wanting freedom for them so badly that you are willing to step into terrain where angels fear to tread. Kindness means having the courage to name, for example, that those sexually abusive comments from dad, they weren't because dad was clueless about how to interact socially. That's what the storyteller believes. No, they were because your dad was aroused by your girlfriends when you brought them over when you were a 15-year-old girl and you brought your girlfriends home. And in fact, dad was actually aroused by you at times as well. Now, this is just an example. I'm not saying this is true of your story, but what's going to happen if you risk saying something like that to the storyteller? You are going to evoke the storyteller's shame. If you get close to the storyteller's shame, if you begin to name things in their story that they feel immense shame about, the storyteller will have contempt for you. They'll get pit. That's a fancy way of saying they'll get mad at you. Are you willing to suffer that? Here's the dilemma with being kind. Your kindness, more often than not, will evoke the storyteller's ambivalence. Ambivalence is feeling two contradictory things like at the same time. All right. When you're kind, the storyteller will want you to move closer to them because we all crave kindness. and they will simultaneously push you away. That's what ambivalence is. Ambivalence is come closer, go away, come closer, go away. Why might your kindness prompt them to push you away? Two reasons. First, it will connect the storyteller to their immense unmet need for kindness. They've just read you a story about a boy or a girl who was unseen and abandoned and humiliated. They have not likely experienced many people who were willing to be attuned to them and genuinely attuned to them and responsive to them. Therefore, your kindness in pushing in pursuing them, will trigger what's called the attachment circuitry in their brain. The attachment circuitry is just those portions of our brain that are designed to need another person. The parts of your brain that come online when you trust another person, connect with another person, need another person. And the storyteller has likely spent most of their life trying to not need other people. That's what trauma does. They've spent much of their life trying to convince themselves that they can do life alone because no one was ever there for them. Right? Think back to the story of the boy in the hospital and the 5-year-old that Cathy shared, right? Mom's, when that becomes an embedded trauma, mom is not there for the boy. Nanny can't be there for the boy because of the dynamics. So the boy is alone. And now all of a sudden, 30 years later, someone is there for that boy. You are there for that boy. It will feel agonizing for the storyteller to let themselves feel their longing for your care, their need for your care. They're yearning for the very kindness that you are presently offering them, because it connects them to deep, vast, unmet wells of need in that area, attachment need. Now, second thing your kindness may do to the storyteller, even though I'm saying principle number 2, kindness is very important. Here's the second thing you've got to navigate. It will likely make them suspicious. Okay, people with a history of trauma are suspicious of kindness. Why? Why? Because more often than not, the person who abused us was also very kind to us. And they likely used kindness to groom us and bind our hearts to them. Therefore, our brains have made a linkage between kindness and danger. I still remember Elizabeth. She was the first woman to engage my story, first person to engage my story. She lived several hours away, and so much of our communication was over email. This was over 15 years ago. And she gave me Dan's book, The Wounded Heart, and I read it, and we started an email exchange. And I would send her little snippets, little anecdotes of my story, just a paragraph max. And she would write back with such incredibly kind words. And after reading her email, I mean, I remember this vividly. I could see the room in my mind's eye. I would stare at the computer screen at 3108 Wilson Road, and I would say out loud, there was no one in the house. I would say, "Who are you? Why are you so kind? And when will you leave? Do you hear the suspiciousness?" I didn't know what to do with this woman's kindness. I didn't understand why she was taking the time to listen to my story. I didn't understand why she cared about me. And I was deeply suspicious of her kindness. Why? Because my abuser, my mother, was the kindest person in my world growing up, the sweetest person I knew. So my nervous system, like the nervous systems of many, many traumatized people, had paired kindness with abuse. Therefore, when someone was kind to me, I was immediately suspicious of them. Here is the point. Engaging someone's story, if you want to do this work well, It is a fraught endeavor. It is so fraught. There's no way around this, but there is a way through all the shame and contempt that you might trigger in the storyteller if you have the kindness to stick in it with them. All right, that's principle number 2. Kindness will take you further than skill. Principle 3, we've already talked about it, but I want to go into it in more depth. You have to use the exquisite instrument that is your body. And many of us, sadly, are very disconnected from our bodies, which is to say, we don't have sufficient access to one of the most important tools in our toolkit. All right, your body is going to give you a lot of helpful data that you want to pay attention to when you are listening to and engaging with someone's story. Your body is a lot smarter than you think it is. Your body has a way of knowing things that your cerebral cortex doesn't know, your brain. Now, by the way, just as an aside, when I first heard this stuff, Cathy was probably the person that taught it to me. When I first heard this stuff, I didn't even get it. Okay, I was sitting there in the room, and it didn't make sense to me. My body information, it didn't make sense. So if that's what you're feeling right now, it's okay. Just bear with me. It will. You will learn more about this instrument of your body. The way to access what your body knows is to put yourself into the story that you've just heard. You got to get inside the story. Example, if the story is about a 7-year-old girl waiting for mom to pick her up after elementary school, you need to become a 7-year-old girl sitting outside the curb, outside your elementary school growing up. You don't need to go to hers, just go to the one you know and sit on the curb. What do you see as 2 minutes become 5, become 10, and mom still hasn't shown up? You see all the other kids slowly being picked up and leaving, right? What do you feel as 10 minutes become 20? What do you hear? You hear less and less chatter of kids, right? Less screaming, less talking, less chatter, more stillness, more quiet. As you're left sitting there all alone, all right, you've got to feel that in your body. You have to become 7 again. Because the girl in the story is 7. She's not the 43-year-old sitting in front of you. Now, here's how Dan Allender puts it. I love this. It's a full paragraph, but let me just read it. Dan says, as I listen to a story, I let my imagination see what is happening. I don't merely hear words. I let words create scenes and images. That's the key, scenes and images. It is like reading good fiction. You don't merely read words. You conjure in your mind the hero, how he or she looks, speaks, moves, laughs, fights. When an action scene arises, you can feel your heart rate increase and your muscles tighten as danger is engaged. All right, that's the way Dan Allender puts it. So in other words, as the story engagement unfolds, as you guys go back and forth, the story needs to become like a movie in your mind that you can fast forward and rewind at will. Now, here's the difficulty with this. If you let yourself become a 7-year-old girl sitting on the curb waiting for mom to pick you up, you, not the storyteller, you are going to feel things in your body that you may not want to feel. And this is all the more true when the story is one of sexual abuse or physical abuse or verbal abuse. You don't want to feel the terror of a 10-year-old boy who's being hit by his father. But to the degree that you were able to put yourself in the shoes of the boy or the girl in the story, to that degree, you will have a felt sense in your body of what the boy or girl was feeling and experiencing in the story. And that will allow you to join in a very deep and intimate way with the storyteller. All right, principle 4. I told you we would come back to affect. We're coming back to affect. You need to always be monitoring the storyteller's affect. What does that mean? Affect refers to the storyteller's inner bodily experience. So think of it on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 represents like completely numb, shut down, low arousal. 10 represents, panic or rage, high arousal, amped up. On that scale, 5 to 6, the midpoint, represents a slight feeling of excitement. You're alert, you're present, you're engaged, you're paying attention. Hopefully that's where you are right now. You're in the 5 to 6 zone in your affect. So when you're in the 5 to 6 range, your body is regulated. However, when you go up towards 8, 9, or 10, your body becomes in a state of high arousal marked by emotions, a flood of emotions like panic, terror, or rage. You often feel like a racing heart, a tightening in your chest, your stomach, jitteriness, faster breathing. All right, now conversely, when you go down to 1, 2, or 3, you're in a state of low arousal. This is often marked by a sense of shame, abandonment, hopeless despair. You feel numb and shut down, disconnected, detached, dissociated. Now, you may have noticed I skipped the numbers 4 and 7. Those are the sweet spots. That's where the magic happens. All right, those are the numbers where your brain can change, where the storyteller can heal. Yes, people can experience genuine healing from even the deepest of wounds. The neurons that compose your brain can be rewired. This is fact. This is not my opinion. There is no disagreement about this. Okay. However, this rewiring can only occur in a particular emotional environment, namely one in which the storyteller engages a portion of their story with enough emotional closeness to become somewhat dysregulated, but not too dysregulated. And the term for this is the term window of tolerance. Your window of tolerance, I think this was either Pat Ogden or Dan Siegel coined it. It refers to this window from 4 to 7. And this is the range of physiological arousal that your brain can tolerate and still remain present. Those are the spots where you're engaging a story with enough emotional closeness to become somewhat disrupted, but not too disrupted that you're checked out. You're at a 4 when you're telling a particular part of your story and you begin to shut down, you begin to disconnect. You're at a 7 when you're telling a part of your story and you begin to get anxious, you begin to get scared, you begin to get angry, panicky. Now, here's the thing. This is very important. Nothing of benefit can occur. That is, the brain cannot heal when you are on the extremes of either end, 8, 9, 10, or 1, 2, 3. When you are in those zones, either one of them, you're no longer present. The storyteller isn't present. So you always need to be monitoring the storyteller's affect so that you know when they begin to leave their window of tolerance, where they are no longer present. Now, here's a question. What are you supposed to do when someone moves above 8 or below 3? Like when they get dysregulated, what are you supposed to do? And you have 2 tasks in that moment. This is very important. Number 1, help them become aware of what is happening in their body. Help them become aware that they're dysregulated. And then help them either raise their arousal if they've shut down and dissociated, or lower their arousal if they've amped up and they're panicked. Begin by helping them become aware of the sensations in their body. That's the key. What they're feeling. A lot of people with trauma, when we get dysregulated, we don't know it. it took me years, plural, years, to even get the capacity to be aware of when I was dysregulated. I wouldn't know it until the next day. So questions that can help the storyteller with this include things like, can we stop and we might do this with Bethany this afternoon. Can we stop and like take a moment just to check in with your body and see what is happening inside you right now? You're asking permission to just like for the storyteller to notice if they're regulated or not. The goal is to help the storyteller become curious about their internal bodily sensations. And the next step is to help move them back into a regulated state. And by the way, the very act of noticing what is happening in their body, just inviting the storyteller to notice that, it will go a long way to help them get regulated again. Here's a really cool thing about story engagement and about how God designed nervous systems, human beings. The human body is designed to be interactively regulated at times. In other words, what does this mean? If the storyteller is dysregulated, and if you're doing your job well, they will become dysregulated. If the storyteller is dysregulated, your body, as the story engager, will help regulate them as long as you are regulated, grounded, calm. Why? Why? Because nervous systems are affected by other nervous systems. All right. Contrary to popular opinion, the human body is not a closed system. Skin is highly overrated as a barrier. All right. The human body is a very open system. It is highly influenced by other bodies in its midst. I mean, just consider what it feels like for you when you're around somebody who's settled and calm versus when you're around someone who's panicking. The state of the other person's nervous system, it affects yours. So your grounded presence will help interactively regulate the storyteller when they become dysregulated. Don't underestimate the power of your attuned and grounded presence. Now, relatedly, some of you may have already been thinking this in your head. If you become dysregulated during the story engagement, the number one thing to do in that moment is you've got to calm and ground yourself. You've got to self-regulate, because your dysregulation will affect the storyteller's nervous system just like your regulation will. Both regulation and dysregulation are contagious. Now, sometimes a storyteller will be able to return to their window of tolerance, that 4 to 7 range. All right. Sometimes they won't be able to. If they're unable to, you don't want to continue the story engagement. That's a pause sign, right? We don't want people pushing through when they aren't grounded, because that's just re-traumatizing. At the same time, it is very important to understand that just as healing can't occur when someone's on the extreme ends of that scale, it also can't occur if someone's staying, at 5 to 6. Everything's fine. If the storyteller has to get emotionally disrupted enough to push out to 4 or 7. All right, that was principle 4. Principle 5. Your right brain, Cathy mentioned it. You've got 2 brains, a left and a right. Your right brain is so much more important to the storyteller than your left brain. To say it a little bit differently, your emotional presence matters way more than the words that you say. For our purposes today, this is an oversimplification, but it's a very helpful one. Let's just say that the words that you speak to the storyteller, they come from your left brain, and the tone of voice and facial expression with which you communicate those words, those come from your right brain. In other words, verbal communication, left brain, nonverbal communication, right brain. Here's what's crucial to understand. The storyteller is way more interested in your right brain, your nonverbal communication, than your left brain, your words. And I know this can be hard to get our minds around. Why? Let's ask the question, why? Why is the storyteller so attuned to your facial expression and your tone of voice? Well, we all know that words can lie. But the face always tells the truth. It goes back to my Reese Witherspoon example. All right. Nonverbal communication is involuntary and unedited. I don't care how good of an actress she is. If she's surprised, she can't look bored. Why? Because nonverbal communication is it's not voluntary and it's unedited. So suppose the storyteller has just told you something about some sexual thing that she did that she feels immense shame about. All right. Her right brain is going to read your face to determine what you think about that sexual thing that she did. You can, I don't care the words coming out of your mouth. You can say something like, hey, I don't think you're a horrible person for doing that. But inside of you, if you really do think that she's a bad person for doing that sexual thing, it will come across in your nonverbal communication. Good luck hiding that. Because it's involuntary and unedited. And so her right brain is going to receive the implicit communication from your right brain, which is mediated to her by those 42 muscles in your face and your tone of voice. So I don't want to say that the words you speak to others are meaningless. That's going way too far. I love words. Words are important. They matter. However, the primary reason that someone is sharing their story with you is because they want your nonverbal response to their story. They want your nonverbal connection, facial expression, and tone of voice. And that stuff you can't hide. You can't fake. All right, principle 6. We're almost done. Remember that there is always a reason for human behavior. Boy, this is a big one. All right. We're gonna see this with the video clip from the morning show later. Human beings are intentional creatures. This is a premise, all right? This is a claim, all right? You might not agree with it. I feel very strongly about this. If the storyteller was always distant from their father, for example, this claim suggests that there is a reason for that distance. And that reason is rarely as simple as dad didn't do emotions. That's how I explained my dad's distance. He didn't do emotions. Or dad was preoccupied with work and never at home. Boy, suppose the storyteller believes, and many people do, that their story with mom or dad, we'll just say dad, is a story of neglect. Neglect. It might be, but you need to find out. In my experience, neglect is rarely a sufficient explanation. In other words, there is almost always a reason for neglect. There's something that drives neglect. If your dad never paid attention to you, the question is, why? Did dad pay attention to your older sister or your younger brother? Okay, then why didn't he pay attention to you? Your task as a story engager, this is what Cathy was saying, this is my way of saying what she was saying, is to make an incoherent narrative coherent. Your task is to help the storyteller make their narrative, which is incoherent, coherent, clear, understandable, reasonable. Make it make sense. The storyteller might say, I just don't know why my mother was so mean to me. All right. Principle 6 is there's always a reason. And it's never mom was just a mean person. How do I know that? Because the storyteller will have memories of mom being kind to certain people in her life. She wasn't mean all the time to every single person. So if mom has the capacity for kindness, Why was she so cruel to you? All right, principle 7. I've got 1 minute. Repairing rupture is much more important than engaging the storyteller's story perfectly. There's no way to do this work perfectly. All right. There will be times when you miss the storyteller. When you're not attuned to what's happening inside their body. Okay. That's gonna happen. Misattunements happen all the time. They happen between parents and children. They happen between lovers. They happen between coworkers, and they happen between storytellers and story engagers. This is not a big deal as long as it is repaired. Now, what does it mean to repair? To repair is to acknowledge that you've missed the storyteller in some way, that you're no longer tracking with them, that the two of you are no longer joined and connected, and they probably aren't feeling felt anymore. The first step of repair is simply acknowledging that. And then the second step is to reattune, to find out where the storyteller is, what they're feeling about the misattunement, and just to join them there. Now, the more quickly you can repair, the better, which means you want to frequently check in with the storyteller to find out what's happening for them internally. Here's how Cathy put it to me years ago when she was teaching me this. She said, when you've lost someone's face, will you go back? I love that. When you've lost someone's face, will you go back? Story engagement isn't about being right. It's about being attuned enough to the person's face to know that you may have lost them, and then you check in with them and you repair. One of the things, here's my last point, and then we will take a much needed break. One of the things that keeps us from being better story engagers, frankly, is cowardice. We are afraid of saying the wrong thing or saying something hurtful. And here's a secret. You're allowed to screw up. You look, you have to be allowed to screw up because you're not Jesus and you're not going to do this perfectly. You're allowed to misattune. You're allowed to do harm. It is inevitable. The issue is, will you repair? Okay, please take 12 minutes to like shake it off. Go to the bathroom, get something to drink. We will come back right at 10 a.m. Pacific time.